Hopefully you can hear me. My name's Phil Gibbons, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tom Celebrezzi and Dr. David Niperis. But first, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which we're meeting, and that's the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and of course, the First Nations people from across New South Wales, because that's the focus of the talk today. So, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So Tom Celebrezzi, who's going to kick off the talk, is currently the Director of Science, Strategy and Impact for New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. And Tom drove the development of the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Act, and has been involved in biodiversity offsets and the Biodiversity Indicator Program, which we're going to hear more about today. And Dr. David Niperis is a Senior Scientist at New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, and David's current role is to provide scientific support and project management for the Biodiversity Indicator Program. So without any further ado, Tom, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. And I'll also apologize for wearing sunglasses during this presentation because I somehow set aside my other prescription glasses. So I'm not trying to be too cool. And I guess I'll introduce the presentation, and maybe David, if you're able to present, that would be helpful because we're the technical difficulty at this end. And while David's looking at that, I will explain. So the Biodiversity Indicator Program is a product of the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Act, which, as was mentioned, I was the policy director at that time, driving through that legislation. And it's an innovative new program which, for the first time in New South Wales, embeds in our legislation the requirement to have a program to collect, monitor, and assess information about biodiversity. This was seen at the time as quite important because, as we all know, oftentimes measurements and monitoring go by the wayside with a preference for programs. And so by having it directly in the legislation, we ensured that this program would be delivered. Next slide, thank you. So the regulations set out what that program is to do, including a number of steps which have already occurred. So we worked with the CSIRO, the Australian Museum, and Macquarie University to develop a method for the biodiversity indicators, which has been published, and that method explains the range of indicators that will be developed and what they're to do. So that was published in May of 2019. Next slide. So as this crowd would all know, but perhaps is not as well known to the general public, biodiversity is quite complex, and there is both known biodiversity and unknown biodiversity. So I think most people on the street would assume that we know mostly what biodiversity there is, but this audience would be aware that that's not true. There's a huge range of biodiversity that's unknown. So that was a fundamental consideration in developing the indicator program, was how do we deal with these unknowns. Next slide. Also, we're finding that the public are beginning to become aware that biodiversity includes everything from ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. And of course, the legislation covers all of that. So the indicator program also considers all three of these levels of biodiversity. We use this model for considering how to design the program. So what you'll be seeing today is mostly a report of those indicators that we've developed. Of the 30 or so indicators that we've notionally described, the first ones we developed were ones about state, so the state of biodiversity, status and trends, and that will then help inform government interventions and help us to understand opportunities, and we'll see some of those today. So when we look at what the legislation requires, it does require developing a program that addresses both biodiversity and this concept of ecological integrity, which is described here. We then broke down biodiversity into two separate streams. the state and all jurisdictions in Australia require special consideration of threatened entities. So that was one stream of biodiversity. And then also the status of biodiversity in general. And then for ecological integrity, we look at both at aspects of quality, management, et cetera. So by having this typology, we're then able to break down the different components of biodiversity into different indicators, rather than trying to produce one index that says what the state of biodiversity is in New South Wales. As we'd all know, that's if you're operating a complex piece of equipment like an aircraft, you need a dashboard that has all of the relevant features similar to biodiversity. If government's looking at how to manage something so complex, there's no point just trying to bundle it up into one particular figure. These are the groups of indicators. So I won't read them all, but I guess you'll get the impression that there's quite a lot of work in this program. And where we're arriving today is we have Biodiversity Outlook Report that covers about 11 different indicators, and we're now considering which further indicators to develop. This process has been focused on transparency. So as I mentioned, we've already published the method. We've published our first Outlook report, and we've published the technical reports and data sets that, that drive those indicators, so that anyone could rerun these indicators themselves and should come up with the same figures if they use the same data. And they can look under the bonnet to see what the algorithms are that drive these indicators. It also is worth noting, I suppose, here that over time, we'll learn how, and we'll change these and backcast so that we should be able to still see status and trends over time, recognizing that as we learn more, we may change some of the algorithms for the indicators. We've also published a fire and environment report using the methods for the Biodiversity Outlook Report, so that for the first time, we actually have a follow-up, and that has provided us some insight into the impact, the immediate impact of the 2019-20 bushfires in New South Wales. The Biodiversity Outlook Report presented 10 indicators and a number of case studies. And as I mentioned, all of the material is publicly available. It's worth having a look at that Outlook Report because it is written for a broad audience. And then if you're interested in more detail, there are technical reports that explain the rationale for each of the indicators. Those were peer reviewed before they were finalized. So I'll hand over to David Nippers to look at the first Biodiversity Outlook Report.
Thanks, Tom. Oh, I've frozen. Hopefully you can hear me. I did notice there was a couple of things in chat, but I've noticed also that if I try and look at what's in chat, it goes out of full screen. So hopefully it's nothing. Somebody's desperately trying to contact me about anything. All right, so what I'm going to look at is the results in the first Outlook report and break down some of those indicators for you. We'll start with ecosystem quality, and within that, what we call the habitat condition indicator family, for which there are two indicators in the Outlook report: ecological condition of terrestrial habitat and ecological carrying capacity of terrestrial habitat. So we have in the Outlook report this sort of traffic light system, which I'm afraid is not great for people with colour blindness, but nevertheless, you know, left is low values, and actually in this case, left is poor values, and right is good values. So essentially, we tend to report things as percentages, and we have an estimate of confidence as well with those. So that's sort of generally how we're reporting things in the Outlook report. I will explain a little bit as to what these indicators actually are. So what we did here was we generated some spatial models from a combination of data sets, including remote sensing data sets, getting at this concept of ecological condition. So another way of thinking of that is intactness of terrestrial habitat. Every pixel, so this is a 90-meter resolution, so every pixel gets a score between 0 and 100% in terms of its intactness, where intactness is defined as a 1750 state, and that's established via a generalized dissimilarity model if you want to know a bit more detail behind that. So this is a more colorblind friendly scale. So where the oranges are low values and the bluey greens are higher values. And as you can see, we've tended to take the approach that we report at both a state level and at a bioregion level. So these are IBRA bioregions you're looking at here. And obviously you can see here we've got a bit of a blow up here of this particular bioregion. So that's condition, and then we have another indicator called carrying capacity, ecological carrying capacity, and that is ecological condition down-weighted by connectivity. So in a situation where you might have an area of high ecological condition, but it's surrounded by areas of low ecological condition, then that gets down-weighted. So the idea here is we're really trying to get at the concept of effective habitat area, which is both based on the intactness of the habitat and the connectivity of that habitat. So that allows us to effectively partition under the assumption that in the pre-industrial state, that is around 1750, we had 100% intactness with respect to the habitat in New South Wales. And then we're estimating a 33% is the case now when measuring ecological carrying capacity. And if you don't include the concept of connectivity, if you don't downweight by connectivity, then you gain another 11%. So therefore we effectively have 44% condition, 33% carrying capacity. And it's just a coincidence that everything seems to be a multiple of 11. It's just the way it worked out. So then we've got, and then we can also, of course, break this down within the constraints of the spatial resolution. We can break that down into any spatial unit we want. So for example, we can look at how national parks, what average condition and carrying capacity is in national parks compared to the rest of the state. And so this is like a frequency. This is a frequency distribution of those carrying capacity values. Internally, we've been referring to this figure as the beached whale due to its shape. Note the log scale. So it can be a little bit deceptive, but essentially we get. And here we're comparing national parks to other tenures, and yeah, national parks have considerably more high condition habitat in them, which is to be expected, but it's also in itself a sort of performance metric of the extent to which we've actually managed to protect habitat that's still in good condition in New South Wales. There is a line here at 60, so we decided on a cutoff of 60% carrying capacity if we wanted to talk about this in a binary way, as in good effective habitat and not effective habitat. And using that, we can get a statistic which says that 62%, I need to move this window so I can actually read this, 62% of national parks, that is 62% of the area of national parks has habitat carrying capacity above 60%. So obviously, if you think about some national parks where they have quite unusual, they have thin extended shapes and things like that, and it's around Lane Cove National Park, which is just down the road from where I am right now, is a good example of something that's long and thin and surrounded by urban areas. So while the condition inside a park is pretty good, the carrying capacity is relatively low because of a lack of connectivity. So moving on, so the reason I introduced those spatial models first is because they underpin quite a lot of our other indicators. So we have another indicator called persistence of ecosystems for vascular plants in this case, which is the percentage of ecosystem diversity that exists or is likely to exist. So I won't explain it more than that because it's on the next couple of slides, but this is, like the sort of the key insight from the Outlook report that we have somewhere between 80 and 84%. It's of course an estimate, which might get refined over time, where we have, and we're making a distinction between that diversity that persists, that which is likely to be lost due to extinction lag or perhaps already lost, and that which we consider to be already lost. And so how we're doing this, again, Underlying this is a generalized dissimilarity model. I can certainly provide more detail about that outside of this seminar, where we have a classification of ecosystem types of 250 ecosystem types across the state. And what we're relying on for this estimate is essentially the relationship between the effective habitat area, in this case, ecological carrying capacity, and diversity. So in other words, it's a species area relationship, or in this case, an ecosystem area relationship, if you will. And so that allows us to make an estimate for the state and for bioregions as to the percentage of ecosystem diversity being retained at this point in time. And I should just add that we're now starting to use this information in the land management biodiversity conservation reforms. So it's starting to look at it as informing this New South Wales state approval process, vegetation clearance approval process. Right, so if you like, a broad take-home message here is that bioregions with the smallest proportion of good quality habitat are at greatest risk of further biodiversity loss. And so I'll just flip back to that slide. So things that are getting close to what we might consider the cliff of the species area relationship, or in this case, the ecosystem area relationship. Oh, and in fact, if I thought about it, I would have known that that slide was coming. So and here if I just draw a somewhat arbitrary eyeball line on that curve, you can see that we're talking about how close some of these bioregions are. In this case, this is the Northwest Slopes bioregion down here. Is starting to get disturbingly close to falling off the cliff in terms of further biodiversity loss. So now I'm moving, because how I've arranged this talk is actually sort of backwards, in the sense that we start at the back of the Outlook report and moving my way forward. And that's got a lot to do with the fact that sometimes it's easier to introduce the spatial models and the habitat models, because like I said, a lot of the other indicators are informed by those models. However, having said that, this indicator here is not informed by those models. This is informed instead by threatened species listings in New South Wales. So expected survival listed threatened species. So we have a little over 1,000 listed threatened species in New South Wales, which of course have got statuses like extinct, what used to be called presumed extinct, critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable. Now, in the literature, there's some estimates of probability of survival, or if you prefer, probability of extinction over certain timeframes for species in those categories. So we used those to come up with an expected survival indicator, which is quite simple, really. It's the sum of probabilities of survival of members of a set, which gives you the number, the expected number of that set you would expect to survive over some time frame, and of course you can turn that into a percentage given the number you started with. So that allows us to partition, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. That allows us to partition the value into that bit which is expected to survive, that bit which we expect to be lost, and that bit that we think is already lost. So I should just add, and this is important, that while these figures do seem quite disturbing, and they are, is that that includes that proportion that is very likely to have already been lost, those species that are known to be extinct in New South Wales, or listed as extinct in New South Wales rather. I should just add that we actually do allow those species a very small probability of actually still being around, because it has been known for species thought to be extinct to appear again. So we don't give them a 0 probability of survival. We give them a very small probability of survival. A considerable innovation in the Biodiversity Indicator Program is the introduction of Pyelogenic Diversity to a statewide biodiversity program or monitoring program. And so this is still in development. We're still expanding our scope with this, but at the time the Outlook report came out, we had phylogenetic trees, comprehensive phylogenetic trees, that is including every species known to occur in New South Wales for birds, frogs, and mammals. And that allows us to estimate what proportion of those trees we expect to survive given the threat status of those species. So we are assuming that species that aren't on the threatened species list are secure or relatively secure. Again, we don't assume that they have 100% probability of survival, it's less than that. but based on those assumptions, we can estimate what proportion of the entire phylogenetic tree, and thus what the term we tend to use, we've been using is evolutionary heritage, what proportion of evolutionary heritage for New South Wales we would expect to survive, what proportion we expect to be lost, and what proportion we expect, we think is already lost. And so most concerning on this graphic is that this rather significant amount of phylogenetic diversity that's already been lost to New South Wales, considering those historical mammal extinctions. And here's an example of that broken down for you a little bit. So in fact, this is a bit of scenario analysis, which is something else that we're working on in New South Wales Government at the moment. And this is, if we're looking at just bandicoots for New South Wales, on the left-hand side is effectively the current situation, which is those branches in black are extinct in New South Wales. Some of them, however, are present in other states. The green is those parts of the tree that are relatively secure, and the grey are those parts of the tree that are under some threat. In this case, the southern brown bandicoot being endangered. And given that its nearest relative, the golden bandicoot, is extinct in New South Wales, that means that that branch connecting the golden bandicoot and the southern brown bandicoot to the rest of the tree is also at threat. So, and on the right-hand side is, I will admit, a very ambitious scenario where we managed to reintroduce the golden bandicoot, southern brown bandicoot, no, not southern brown bandicoot, reintroduce the golden bandicoot, the western barred bandicoot and the greater bilby to New South Wales, and make those populations secure, as well as securing the southern brown bandicoot. If under that scenario, we were able to do all of those things, then we would recover quite a significant amount of evolutionary heritage for New South Wales. So it's not necessarily permanently lost. This is, of course, a probabilistic kind of assessment. So moving on, we very similarly worked on expected existence of listed threatened ecological communities. So very much the same sort of principle. We estimated a probability of existence. Survival seemed like an unusual term to use for an ecological community, in the next 100 years, and summed up the total and then divided by the number we started with to get a proportion and thus a percentage. So, and obviously these are just assuming that we don't have any effective management. Under these scenarios are under the assumption of no effective management. And so moving on again, so obviously that stuff was species that are known and species that for which their conservation status, their extinction probability, if you will, are known. But that obviously is very much the tip of the iceberg in biodiversity, and so we want to try and get at the rest of it. So we have a couple of other indicators that try and make some estimate of that broader amount of diversity at a species level. So we did this for vascular plants, and we started by getting what we called a representative species set. So representative in the sense of representing the diversity of environments, or habitats, if you will, habitat types in New South Wales. So it's a list of vascular plant species representing that diversity of habitats in New South Wales. And we did that again via a generalized dissimilarity model. And then we estimated the area of habitat originally occupied by each of those species and what proportion of that persisted using our ecological carrying capacity, and therefore what proportion has been lost. And based on that information, we assigned each species a risk category and therefore at least a notional probability of survival over some time frame. And that's how we came to this value of 73%. And so I consider it a lower limit of in terms of expecting to survive. And then these other indicators effectively, so this one here, extent area occupied, is essentially the average percentage of original habitat we think is currently occupied by each of these representative species. So, you know, we calculate this part first, and then we calculate the expected survival from that. And then this other indicator, which is really quite innovative as well, is trying to come up with an estimate of how much genetic diversity we think has been retained and therefore how much has been lost. This is again based on a sort of species area relationship, except this time it's a relationship between effective habitat area and genetic diversity. So it's been parameterized from some data that's collected in the Northern Hemisphere. Unfortunately, we don't have the data, we don't have it parameterized for Southern Hemisphere or more particularly Australia, but it's an estimate of how much genetic diversity we might have lost from populations given the loss in habitat area for those species, and then averaged across those species. There's both a lower and upper limit because of course species vary in their capacity to disperse and otherwise sustain themselves. You know, various reasons why we get variation in loss of genetic diversity, the relationship between loss of genetic diversity and loss of habitat area. And so we put a lower and upper limit on that, again, parameterized from data that we had available from the Northern Hemisphere. And this is just showing the same sort of thing graphically. So again, showing these risk categories that we assign species based on habitat loss, what on average the extent of habitat is for those species originally and what proportion has been lost for each of those risk categories. And we've also got here that range across risk categories of retained or genetic diversity, that both the upper and lower limit. So moving on to ecosystem management, we don't currently have a specific indicator for this other than a very straightforward thing. So we treated this as a case study rather than a true indicator, which is just what percentage of the state is currently covered by national parks reserves. And we also looked at private reserves as well. And so we can, over the time we can track that trend. We're currently looking into coming up with indicators based on, well, you've already seen the one with respect to, you know, what carrying capacity that represents, but we can also start looking at what proportion of biodiversity in New South Wales is likely to be captured by the current reserve system. So in other words, the representativeness of that reserve system and other indicators of that nature. And like I said, we're very interested in private reserve, like private conservation land as well. So this is just those key insights, which is like not the front page, but early on in the Outlook report. So like I said, I'm basically doing the Outlook report backwards for the most part. So this is the order in which they are introduced in the actual Outlook report. So you can see what the key insights are. So I haven't touched on absolutely everything. Or maybe I have. No, I have. I have touched on absolutely everything in terms of those key numbers. That we report on in the Outlook report. So like Tom mentioned previously, there is a fire and environment report. So obviously with the big fires that happened in 2019 and 2020, there was a strong desire in the department and from the minister to say, what can we say about what the impact of this on these biodiversity indicators? So we produced a report. I shouldn't say we, I didn't have that much to do with it, but the program produced this report specifically for the impact of the fire on two of our key indicators. So one being effective habitat area, that is ecological carrying capacity, and our inference from that about what effect that's had on the persistence of ecosystem diversity in New South Wales. I should just add that this is within the fire ground, so because we can define these things quite strictly in the spatial sense, but also we have an expectation that that is not a permanent reduction in effective habitat area, that some of that loss will be recovered, if not all. I should just say that, I should also say that we have indicators in development. So here's two that are in active development now, but we're also moving towards Biodiversity Indicator Program 2.0. But at the moment, actively in development, in fact, close to completion, are these two indicators, one on invasive species and one on community appreciation of biodiversity. So expect to see those sometime next year. And you can find out more by using Google or Bing or your preferred search engine. to look up the Biodiversity Indicator Program. So I'll say we have a main website, we have our publications are all available online, and in the SEED portal, which is a sharing and enabling environmental data portal for New South Wales environmental data, we have a main landing page for all our data packages. So you'll be able to drill down into all our data as well from there. And with that, I think I will stop sharing. And I assume we can open up for questions or something.
Yeah. Could I butt in and ask the first question? So thanks for that. That was a fantastic talk. It's a very impressive program. And you know what? One thing I really liked, David and Tom, is that you've identified, and not many people do, that it's those most cleared landscapes where there's the greatest potential for rapid species loss. And it's interesting, I did a study on the Native Vegetation Act recently, and it's interesting that land clearing is more likely to occur in the more fragmented landscapes, and offsetting is more likely to occur in the more intact landscapes. And of course, that is opposite to what you'd like. So my question is, you know, have you had any success in translating this research to date in terms of government programs or decision making?
I can certainly speak to that. Do you want to speak to it first, Tom?
Yeah, look, I will mention that the fact you just pointed out, I guess, brings two things together. There's the New South Wales Biodiversity Offsets Program, which is about primarily urban development, and it does allow trading rules in which some offsets can occur in adjacent bioregions. But also relevant is the Private Land Conservation Program, which is quite separate and is a fund of for incentives. And it's run by the Biodiversity Conservation Trust in New South Wales. And so our agency develops a biodiversity conservation investment strategy, and the next iteration of that will certainly be informed by that observation. So that, and in any case, already was focused on overcleared and underrepresented areas. So that's probably the most direct way I can see that particular issue being applied. We, I guess, are also talking to our colleagues in agriculture about what this might mean for land management practices in those areas. David, did you want to add something?
Yeah, all I was going to say is that I'm not sure what I'm allowed to say, but essentially that we're actively talking about this stuff internally, and we're using those indicators to inform what it looks like, you know, in terms of what's on the cards for approvals and for offsetting. So we can actually do some scenario analysis, I think would be the way to describe it.
I can't see if others are raising hands or yet. So I might ask a question back to the group, and maybe that will prompt you. Are there aspects of this indicator program that you see as relevant to your current research interests? And what do you, and can you tell us a bit more about that? So hopefully there'll be some volunteers.
Pick one you. I can leave it up as a panelist as well.
So I guess while we're waiting for you to think about that, I'll point out something that I think is particularly interesting that was not intuitively obvious before we did this program, which is that while habitat effectiveness in New South Wales is reduced to 34 or 33%, and that's not surprising because of the history of land clearing over the last 250 years and other factors. What is kind of surprising is the within species genetic diversity that's still likely to be persisting in the state. So looking back, that seems maybe not that surprising, I suppose, because plants are found in small patches all around the state, and that is a surrogate for the genetic diversity, that distribution is a surrogate for that. But that does point to some opportunities and the importance perhaps of those smaller remnants, which maybe in the past we've tended to focus on the intactness factors. So that's one insight which I think is, in a way, a kind of silver lining. It's not all lost in New South Wales. There's been a lot of clearing, but the material, the raw material is still there. And as we enter this climate change period, we'll see in vivo what happens with those species in terms of how genes are expressed and which individuals survive, intense cooking. So I think it's telling us something that we didn't know before. Great, thank you.
I see there's a couple of questions. The only management seems to be dedicating reserves. Are there any active management ideas like fire, more or less? Yes, is the short answer to that. So we're actively developing more indicators, and yes, we know where the holes are in the program, and one of them is definitely management. I should just add that we're also looking at how Saving Our Species and Biodiversity Indicator Program, which are two separate programs inside DPI, can integrate and inform each other. So they can provide us with species level indicators, and we can provide them with program-wide indicators. So that's happening as well. So we can start reporting on those sorts of I guess the aggregate outcome of a bunch of small-scale conservation actions. The second question I'm seeing here is about genetic diversity. What I didn't specifically say and should have done was the genetic diversity. I talked about phylogenetic diversity, and I talked about I just called it genetic diversity. When I said genetic diversity, I meant within species genetic diversity. So the diversity within a species after loss of habitat. So we're making an estimate of how much of that original genetic diversity within a species has been retained after loss of habitat. But phylogenetic diversity is very much the between species diversity. And so that's expressed in millions of years of independent evolution.
Yeah, and I'll just comment that that's also being incorporated into our threatened species program in terms of prioritization for the first time. So that's another example of how the indicator program is already being used.
Had a meeting about it this morning. Has any link been made yet between this program's finding and the role of TSRs in Western conservation? I'm not sure what the acronym is. What's TSR? Travelling
stock routes and reserves.
Oh, right.
I guess I can comment that the TSRs would have been included in the modelling in terms of the vegetation condition and connectivity.
I'm nodding furiously. It's true.
Yeah. But the number was not included. I think about 2% of New South Wales is in those reserves, and they were not included in our calculation of the percentage of land which is managed for national parks. So those areas would be looked at in terms of the management indicator. They have somewhat less security than national parks do, but they, of course, are part of the public estate. I can't see if there's other questions there.
Doesn't look like it.
Yeah.
Not yet.
All right. Well, let's see. So just one other comment before we wrap up. It's interesting, only 9% of New South Wales in formal protected areas, which I thought that surprised me. I'd never seen that figure, and I thought it was a bit low, because I think it's 19% nationally, but of course it's beefed up by IPAs, Indigenous Protected Areas, isn't it? Very large areas of IPAs. Yeah. So it shows, because I can't see that New South Wales is any different to most states. Maybe Victoria might be a bit higher. So that suggests that those IPAs might be actually really, really overinflating our AECI target figure. Yeah. So So that's interesting. It's it's a low figure really.
It's grown, well, I don't know what the figures are, but there's multiple national parks have been declared in the past year.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what the total hectareage is, but you know, we're going to expect that 9% to bump up a little bit for the next Outlook report.
And of course, like you said, the representativeness, the figure alone is a bit of a blunt instrument, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So anyway, look, it's a fantastic talk. It's fantastic research. I had the pleasure of reviewing some of this stuff a couple of years ago, and it really is fantastic. And so I'd just like to thank you, David and Tom, for coming along, and thank you for everyone for putting up with the delay, and thanks so much for Pete for persisting. Pete, you look a bit more relaxed now. So so thank you all, and join me in a virtual. Well, thank you.
Thank you. And please do get in touch with us if you see connections with your research and would like to collaborate with us about how to use the indicator program.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Dig into our data.